What if the Dyatlov Pass incident was real? On February 1st, 1959, searchers cut a hole in a tent pitched on a snowfield at 1,700 feet in the northern Ural Mountains. The tent was a standard tourist model for 9. Inside, investigators found 9 sets of footprints leaving the tent on bare feet, in socks, in one shoe, inward-facing cuts in the canvas made from the inside. The hikers' boots, coats, and pants were inside, where they had been sleeping. This was a ski touring expedition from the Ural Polytechnic Institute. 8 students and a graduate student leader. All had passed the Institute's winter camping exam. All had been on multi-day ski trips before. The group had failed to return. Anatoly Utochkin, the head of the Institute and the brother of one of the missing students, dispatched a search party on February 12th after 11 days of silence. The searchers expected survivors. An empty camp greeted them instead. The diary of the group leader ended mid-word. The last entry was dated February 1st. The cuts in the tent were the first clue. Igor Alexeyevich Dyatlov, 23, was the leader, a fifth-year radio engineering student, born in Sverdlovsk, then named for a Stalinist bureaucrat, later renamed Yekaterinburg. Dyatlov had designed the route himself. He had read every report of every previous attempt. He had argued the institute should let him lead it. Zinaida Kolmogorova, 22, was an engineering student, the only one of the group who had completed the institute's master ski program. Yuri Krivonishenko, 23, an engineering student with a reputation for bad jokes and worse survival decisions, but excellent endurance. Lyudmila Dubinina, 21, an engineering student, the strongest skier in the institute, an orphan. Alexander Kolovatov, 24, an engineering student. Rustam Slopsov, 23, an engineering student and a former soldier. Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, 23, a French-born engineering student on an exchange program from the University of Poitiers, a Frenchman in a Soviet ski party in the Urals. Alexander Zolotaryov, 38, the only non-student, an older graduate student and a former soldier, a war veteran with a known obsession with the area. Yuri Yakovlev, 22, was the 10th member of the group, but on January 28th, he turned back alone. He had developed a chronic pain in his leg and sciatica, and the group voted to let him go. He walked out, descended the ridge, and was not with the group when the tent was cut. 2 instructors and 3 other rescue workers would be killed in the weeks that followed on the way to the Dyatlov group in a separate avalanche in the same mountains in the same month of the same winter. At some time in the early hours of February 1st, the group cut their way out of the tent, inward-facing cuts made from the inside. A knife that was still inside the tent afterward by a person who did not take the knife with them. 3 different heights for the cuts. The highest cut was at chest height, suggesting the person cutting was already standing on something when they made the cut, or that they were unusually tall. Reanalysis of the cuts happened twice, once in 2012, once in 2020. Both analyses concluded the cuts were consistent with a person inside the tent, holding the canvas from the inside, cutting outward, with the hand positioned at the level shown by the cuts. Knee height for the first cut, chest for the second, shoulder for the third. A person standing up, leaning back, and cutting higher as the canvas parted. This group was trained. They were not panicking in a way that left only one boot behind. Cutting the tent is consistent with a sudden, severe, time-pressure event that did not allow for the routine act of putting on winter boots and a coat. Found on the slope below the tent, the diary of the group ends with the words torch and manka. Torch is a flashlight. Manka is a porridge. Both were routine items the group was carrying. The diary does not describe the cut or the climb down. The diary ends at the moment of the cut. The cut was not a fluke. The cut was a decision made by people who knew what they were doing, under a pressure severe enough to abandon 9 pairs of boots, a working stove, and the rest of a winter camp. 2 days after the cut, on February 4th, the search party found a cedar tree at the bottom of the slope below the tent, 1.5 kilometers from the cut, in the direction the group had fled. Branches on the cedar were broken at 5 meters up. Lower branches were stripped of bark. Bark on the upper branches was scarred by what looked like fingernails, or by what looked like a person climbing the tree in extreme conditions. Cuts and the scars went up to about 5 meters, then stopped. A barefoot hiker would not climb to 5 meters. Underneath the cedar, the searchers found a small fire, lit in a depression in the snow, lined with torn clothing, still smoking when the searchers found it. 2 of the 9 bodies were on the cedar, in postures consistent with climbing and falling. 1 body was on a branch, looking up. Another was on a branch, looking down. Clothing used to start the fire had been cut from the bodies of the dead, lit by a person who had cut the clothing off a dead companion and used the clothing to insulate the next attempt at staying alive. 5 bodies were found in the first 24 hours. 4 of them were barefoot. 1 was in a sock. None were in winter boots. None were in winter coats. -25 Celsius was the cold at the cedar that night. Wind was steady. A person in a single layer at -25 has about 90 minutes before hypothermia takes hold. A person with frostbite on every finger has much less. The remaining 4 bodies were not found until May 4th, when the snow melted, about 75 meters deeper than the cedar, in the direction the group had fled, dressed in pieces of clothing taken from the 5 at the cedar. Clothing that had been cut with a knife, not torn. Dubinina's body was missing the tongue, missing the lips, missing the eyes, and bearing a major fracture of the right side of the skull, with a missing piece of bone the size of a fist. That missing piece was not found. Kolovatov had a major fracture of the right side of his skull. Thibault Brignol had a major fracture of the right side of his skull. Slopsov had multiple fractures of the right side of his skull, with extensive soft tissue damage. 3 of the 4 had fractures that were not survivable. All fractures on the right side, major ones. None on the left. None in the abdomen. None in the chest. Force applied from outside, from the right, at a velocity that no human hand can produce. Head unprotected at the moment of the force. An avalanche at 1,700 feet in the northern Urals in February is rare, but it does happen. Pattern does not match. A fall down a ravine produces fractures in many places, with no specific pattern of side. Pattern does not match. A human attack produces fractures of a different shape, with different soft tissue damage, with different bone fragments. Pattern does not match. Soviet criminal investigators who examined the 4 at the ravine used the term compelling natural force. English equivalent is force majeure. What they thought the force was, they did not write down. May 1959 was when the investigators closed the case and transferred the file to a Soviet civilian archive. Declassified in the 1990s, the Soviet autopsy reports are not signed, not dated in a useful way, written in a style that mixes the technical and the bureaucratic. 3 different pathologists in 2 different cities, with a level of detachment that the surviving relatives of the 9 found disturbing. Hypothermia was the cause of death for the 5 at the Cedar. No major injuries. Small cuts, bruises, and the early signs of frostbite. The pattern is consistent with dying of cold after a flight from a working tent into a snowstorm. Different story at the ravine. Fractures described in the previous chapter. No defensive wounds on the arms. No defensive wounds on the hands. High levels of radiation on the clothing. On the outside, not the inside. Levels that would be produced by a contamination event, not by a single point source. Dubinina's missing tongue and eyes were not eaten by animals. Searchers found no tooth marks on the body, no tracks at the ravine, and no droppings at the ravine. Tissue of the lips, the tongue, and the eyelids was removed by a cutting instrument after death. in a pattern that the pathologists described as external intervention and refused to describe further. In their written reports, the pathologists noted that the bodies had been at the ravine for at least 2 months when they were found. Poor condition of the soft tissue. Missing soft tissue that could have been removed by scavengers in the absence of a faster explanation. What the faster explanation was, they did not write down. Then the pathologists closed their section of the case. File went to the civilian archive. Relatives were given a brief written summary that did not mention the radiation, the missing tongue, or the missing eyes. 2020 was the year a geophysics paper was published in Nature Geoscience. Alexander Puzrin of ETH Zurich, with a team of 7. Puzrin's paper proposed that the 9 died in a small, delayed action slab avalanche on the slope above the tent. Small slab, below the threshold of a typical avalanche, would not have buried the tent, but it would have driven the group to cut the tent and flee down the slope in the conditions they were in. Puzrin proposed that the fractures on the floor at the ravine were caused by a fall down the slope and onto rocks after the cut, that the radiation on the clothing was from the routine contamination of a Soviet-era fluorescent watch dial, magnified by the laboratory's measurement methodology.